Okay, today we're going to talk about the utility death spiral. So the three quasi-final exam questions for today are: what are the different factors at work in the so-called utility death spiral? What would be the consequences of the utility death spiral for both electricity customers and utility investors? And number three, what measures are commonly undertaken by utilities to improve shareholders' situation in response? So at this point, we should all be somewhat familiar with how the electric power industry developed. We've talked about how decisions early in the history of the electric power industry to use AC versus DC systems resulted in the use of centralized electric power, and also the decision to regulate utilities as monopolies. We also talked about the need for a diverse portfolio of different generation types in order to ensure reliable provision of electricity. We also have talked about why these choices were made. A lot of it hinged on this need for reliable electricity, but also the objective all along was really to provide the lowest cost service possible. And we've also talked about the ways in which the electric power industry has evolved over the last 2 decades. So let's try to think about 3 to 4 ways that the electric power industry has changed since about the year 2000. One of the big changes that we've talked about is market deregulation, at least in some regions of the United States. We've moved away from the regulated monopoly utility model, the monopoly consensus, and have moved towards competition, at least on the wholesale level. This time period has also been marked by more stringent environmental regulations, many of which have targeted coal-fired power plants. The advent of cheap natural gas, driven in large part by horizontal hydraulic fracturing, which is this new way of getting natural gas out of the ground. And as supply for natural gas has increased, prices have decreased. And also cost competitive renewable energy. So wind and solar are pretty quickly dropping in price. And so they're directly competing with other more conventional types of generation at this point. So the backdrop for all of these changes, we should also think of as the climate crisis, this increased recognition of the importance of carbon dioxide emissions from electric power plants in driving anthropogenic climate change and the potential very significant implications of climate change. So in our discussions, we've really singled out coal-fired power plants as one of the first and most significant hurdles in reducing the carbon footprint of the electric power industry. So much of the emissions from the electric power industry in the United States come from coal-fired power plants. A lot of the focus has been on retiring those. And we have noted that many coal-fired power plants in the U.S. have retired. There was this big wave of retirement really starting in 2010 up until today. About 20, maybe more than that, percent of the existing coal-fired power plants in the U.S. have been retired. And there are lots of reasons why those plants have been retired, starting with low natural gas prices. Coal-fired power plants are having to directly compete with natural gas power plants. And so in some cases, they're losing market share. Increased regulations is another one. In particular, the Obama administration targeted the emissions of mercury and other air toxics, the cooling systems of coal-fired electric power plants, and then, of course, the Clean Power Plan. Also, competition from renewables. In some cases, renewable energy is directly outcompeting electricity that's being offered by coal-fired power plants, and then also flatline electricity demand growth. We're simply consuming less electricity than we thought we were going to be consuming in the early 2000s. But we talked about this last time. At least publicly, utilities and the federal government expect the majority of existing coal-fired power plants to still be online in 2040. We talked about, in particular, Duke Energy's integrated resource plan that shows that pretty far out into the future, they think that a lot of their existing coal-fired power plants are still going to be an important part of their portfolio. And there are different reasons for this. Some of it has to do with The fact that coal-fired power plants are useful in terms of providing a steady source of electricity throughout the day, and renewables aren't to the point where we can easily or cost effectively combine them with energy storage and replicate that functionality. Another really big part of it is the fact that utilities experience financial inertia, right? So when utilities borrow a lot of money to build infrastructure, for example, coal-fired power plants, they have a mortgage and they have to pay that mortgage off over a long period of time. So the capital costs of these coal-fired power plants are in some cases still being paid off, and they might be reluctant to retire coal-fired power plants early before the projected end life of the plants. And they want to avoid being in a situation where those plants are stranded. In other words, they're no longer selling electricity, but they're still having to pay the mortgage associated with those plants. So last time we talked about ways of forcing utilities to retire these power plants early via policies and legislation that targets carbon emissions, so either a cap and trade policy or a carbon tax. I think both of those remain the most rational and effective way of doing this. But at least right now, comprehensive policy about carbon emissions seems politically unlikely. So then the question is, without carbon legislation, do we have to wait until every single coal plant is paid off, the mortgage is paid off, before we pull them offline? And so the answer is maybe not. And today we're going to explore one possibility for how we could force coal-fired power plants offline, even without comprehensive policies targeting carbon emissions. So the first thing to know when we talk about the utility death spiral is that even though demand for electricity isn't growing much, retail electricity prices, so the price that we as individual customers experience, are increasing, and they have been increasing over time for a while now. A big part of that is the need for renewed capital investment in the grid. So a lot of the transmission and distribution infrastructure that we rely on in the electric power industry is old. It was built a long time ago, and it needs to be improved. So as utilities invest more in the transmission and distribution infrastructure that we need, at least today, to have reliable electricity service, they're taking on additional debt. And that debt translates to annual payments that the utilities have to make. And who's making those annual payments effectively? Well, it's end-use customers. And so as the utilities take on this additional debt, then our electricity prices are increasing. And so this figure shows an example of that. It shows how average electricity prices are projected to increase over time. So that's the first thing to know, is that retail prices for electricity are increasing for individual customers. At the same time, increasingly, there are also opportunities for electricity customers to reduce their dependence on utilities, sort of the conventional incumbent utilities, on centralized electricity production. There are a couple different ways we can do that. The first is on the supply side, as individual customers, and we talked about this before in the context of photovoltaic solar, individual customers can now provide some, if not all, of their own electricity through distributed generation, so rooftop solar or rooftop solar coupled with a battery. The other option for reducing dependence on centralized electricity production or utilities is on the demand side. So we could become more efficient through weatherizing our houses or taking up newer technologies and devices that just require less electricity to work. So we can reduce our electricity consumption that way. So let's look at an example having to do with solar. So here we're going to talk about what's called residential photovoltaic, or PV, grid parity. So grid parity is a situation where the levelized cost of electricity from residential solar, so rooftop solar, is the same as the cost of buying electricity from, for example, your neighborhood utility. At that point, in theory, individual customers would be ambivalent about where they're getting their electricity. So you could think about this yourself. If it was just as expensive to buy a solar panel and put it on your roof and get electricity that way, as it is to buy electricity from Duke Energy, in theory, you shouldn't really care where you're getting your electricity from. And as if the cost of solar were any bit lower than that, you would actually prefer to get electricity from solar panels instead of the utility. And so, what these all these different circles on this figure show is the retail price of electricity in different countries. And the lines that start in the top left and slope down towards the bottom right represent the levelized cost of electricity from solar panels. And the reason they're sloping is because depending on the amount of solar insolation or resource solar availability at a given location, the levelized cost of electricity for solar is different. For example, if you're in a shady part of the world, for example, the UK or Russia or Germany, you don't get that much solar insolation. So those countries are found on the left part of this figure. But parts of the world that are sunny a lot, like Saudi Arabia or the southwestern portion of the United States, are all the way over to the right. And so the levelized cost of electricity in those places is lower. And so, what the different lines represent is the falling cost of solar. So you could each one of those lines, the line at the very top represents 2009, and then the line right underneath it represents 2010, and then you can see 2012, and then at the very bottom 2020 in dark blue. So what this is showing is that as the levelized cost of solar decreases, these lines are dropping down. And what happens when the lines intersect with a dot means that that particular dot finds itself at grid parity, which means that in theory, people should be ambivalent about whether they're buying electricity from the grid, from their neighborhood utility, or or they're just getting their own electricity from solar panels. So not only is the levelized cost of electricity from solar falling, in other words, those slope lines are dropping down gradually, all the dots, all the circles that represent the retail price of electricity in different countries are increasing. So you could think about the circles as bubbles that are floating up while the lines drop down. So gradually, all of these countries are going to experience residential photovoltaic grid parity. So as the cost of solar continues to fall, customers will shift away from utilities if it means saving money. And what that means is that increasingly, traditional utilities customer base and the billions and billions of dollars that go with it is kind of up for grabs. So it's worth thinking about what would widespread adoption of these technologies, rooftop solar, efficiency, smart devices, etc., mean for traditional electric utilities. And in some cases, it could have what we would call a disruptive impact on the conventional utility model. In other words, the whole business model of the electric power industry.